In 1939, a plane took off from Berlin, carrying Nazi Germany's most valuable secrets. Its pilot, a mad Australian who would transform an ordinary fighter plane into an invisible ghost in the skies. The Nazis never saw what was coming. This man outwitted Hitler, revolutionized aerial warfare, and saved thousands of lives with an idea so simple that everyone thought it impossible. His name was Sidney Cotton, and this is the true story of how a determined mechanic built the spy plane that changed the course of World War II. Frederick Sidney Cotton was born on June 17, 1894, at a cattle station in Gorgonga, near Proserpine, Queensland, Australia. He was the third child of Alfred and Annie Cotton, landowners dedicated to cattle ranching in the wild Australian outback. From childhood, Sidney was different. While other boys dreamed of following in their parents' footsteps in the countryside, he looked to the sky with an insatiable curiosity. Life in the Australian outback was tough and demanded discipline. Sidney was sent to the prestigious Southport School in Queensland, where his restless mind and talent for mechanics began to manifest. The boy had an unusual ability to understand how things worked, disassembling and reassembling any equipment that fell into his hands. In 1910, when Sidney was only 16 years old, his family made a decision that would change his life forever. They moved to England. There, he was enrolled at Cheltenham College, one of the most renowned schools in the country. It was in this environment that Sidney had his first contact with aviation, a technology still in its infancy. The Wright brothers had made their first flight only 7 years earlier, and the idea of flying machines still seemed magical to most people. But the Cotton family's stay in England was brief. In 1912, they returned to Australia, and Sidney began working as a jackaroo, training to handle cattle on outback stations in New South Wales. It was hard work under the scorching Australian sun, but Sidney never forgot the fascination with the skies he had discovered in England. Then came 1914, and the world changed. World War I broke out in Europe, and young Sidney Cotton made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He returned to England, determined to join the war effort. Not in the trenches, but in the skies. In November 1915, at just 21 years old, Sidney joined the Royal Naval Air Service. Military aviation was still extremely dangerous and experimental. Airplanes were fragile, engines unreliable, and pilots' life expectancy was measured in weeks, not years. But Sidney had something special, a rare combination of courage, technical skill, and innovative thinking. After only 5 hours of solo flight, an absurdly short time by modern standards, Sidney was sent to patrol the English Channel. Soon after, he was assigned to even more dangerous missions, night bombing raids over France and Germany, with squadrons number 3 and number 5. Flying at night over enemy territory in primitive aircraft without adequate instruments was practically suicide. But it was precisely in these adverse conditions that Sidney's genius began to shine. He perceived a critical problem that all pilots faced: the extreme cold at high altitudes. Temperatures could drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius, and many pilots suffered from severe frostbite. Sidney did not accept this as an unsolvable problem. In 1917, while serving in France, he developed something revolutionary: a one-piece, fur-lined flight suit that kept pilots warm at frigid altitudes. The suit, which became known as the Sidcot, became standard equipment not only for the British Royal Flying Corps and Royal Naval Air Service, but was also adopted by France and the United States Army. This invention saved countless lives, and Sidney Cotton established himself as an innovator in military aviation. But it was only the beginning of an extraordinary career that would change the course of history. When World War I ended in 1918, Sidney Cotton returned to civilian life, but not before another display of his rebellious personality. He resigned his military commission due to disagreements with superior officers, a pattern of behavior that would repeat itself throughout his life. Sidney was never good at following orders when he thought he had a better idea. In October 1917, still during the war, Sidney married Regmore Agnes MacLean, a 17-year-old actress in London. They had a son, but the marriage didn't last. And after the war, Sidney spent some time in Tasmania before returning to England to pursue his passion for aviation. The 1920s were a golden age for adventurous aviators. With the war over, many veteran pilots sought new challenges and ways to make a living with their skills. Sidney was among the most ambitious. In 1920, he embarked on an attempt to fly from England to South Africa, an epic journey that had never been successfully completed. The attempt failed, but Sidney narrowly escaped an accident in the English aerial derby, demonstrating the luck that would accompany him throughout his life. Not content to remain in Europe, Sidney spent 3 years working in Newfoundland, Canada, flying various missions. The vast wilderness of Canada offered unique opportunities for skilled pilots, and Sidney quickly established himself as an expert in aerial search and rescue operations, searching for explorers lost in Newfoundland and Greenland. It was during this period that Sidney met his second wife. In 1926, after divorcing Regmore the previous year, he married Millicent Joan Henry, an 18-year-old actress he had met in Canada. This marriage marked the beginning of a new phase of Sidney's life, where his business activities would expand dramatically. From the late 1920s until the beginning of World War II, Sidney Cotton was involved in an impressive variety of ventures. He had a special talent for identifying opportunities and wasn't afraid to take risks. One of his biggest bets was on color photography, a field still under development. Sidney invested heavily in defied color, a company that had pioneered a new type of color film. Color photography was in its early stages, and most people still believed it would always be a limited niche market. But Sidney saw the potential. Through this investment, Sidney met Alfred A. J. Miranda, Jr., an American closely connected to defied color, who would ultimately make the connection that would change Sidney's life forever. Meanwhile, Sidney speculated on the stock exchange and bought and sold land, accumulating a considerable fortune. He was a man of many talents and more ambitions. He flew, invented, negotiated, and was always looking for the next great challenge. But throughout all these business activities, Sidney never lost his passion for aviation and technical innovation. He continued experimenting with photographic equipment and aircraft, always looking for ways to improve and innovate. His restless mind never rested, always seeking problems to solve and limits to overcome. In the late 1930s, as Europe moved inexorably toward war, Sidney Cotton's unique skills, his expertise in aviation and photography, and his adventurous nature caught the attention of very important people. The stage was being set for this Australian aviator to play a crucial role in the events to come. No one, not even Sidney, could have predicted how vital his contribution would be to the Allied war effort.
The connection that Alfred Miranda made between Sidney Cotton and the British government occurred at the time of the Munich Conference in 1938, a crucial moment in European history. It was Miranda who introduced Sidney to a man named Squadron Leader Frederick Winterbotham. To the outside world, Winterbotham was just a Royal Air Force officer attached to the Air Ministry. In reality, he was a key figure in the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. Winterbotham had an urgent problem. Nazi Germany was rapidly rearming, and Britain desperately needed information on German military installations, troop movements, and war preparations. Traditional espionage methods were risky and slow. What British intelligence needed was someone who could fly over Germany, photograph military installations, and do so in a way that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Winterbotham was looking for a businessman with an airplane, experience flying over Europe, and a willingness to engage in covert aerial photography. In Sidney Cotton, he found exactly the right man. Sidney had all these attributes and one crucial one more. He was absolutely fearless and loved seemingly impossible challenges. Sidney already possessed the perfect aircraft for the job, a twin-engine Lockheed 12A, registered civilly as GAAFTL. It was an elegant and fast aircraft with a completely civilian and innocuous appearance. No one would suspect that this business plane was carrying out espionage for the British government. But Sidney wasn't content to simply use the plane as it was. He began secretly modifying it, applying his characteristic ingenuity to the problem of clandestine aerial photography. 3 RAF F-24 cameras were installed in the fuselage, but with their serial numbers hastily scraped off. If Sidney were forced to land in Germany, there would be no obvious link to the Royal Air Force. Sidney's genius lay in the details. He realized that at high altitudes, the cameras would freeze and the lenses would fog up, ruining the photographs. His solution was brilliantly simple. He cut the camera holes slightly larger than the lenses, allowing the warm air inside the plane to be sucked over the cameras, keeping them warm and functional. It was the same principle he had used in the Sidcot suit, adapted for a completely different problem. For camouflage, Sidney painted the Lockheed 11A in a distinctive light green, which he called duck eggshell green. According to him, this was the best possible camouflage for high altitude, where the aircraft would blend into the sky. It was a theory he would test repeatedly in the following months. In June 1939, just months before the start of World War II, Sidney and his co-pilot Bob Niven flew to Malta. The cover story was that they were researching a possible new route for Imperial Airways, the British airline. From Malta, with the addition of Flying Officer Maurice Longbottom as aerial photographer, they began conducting secret photographic reconnaissance flights over the Middle East. Sidney posed as a wealthy Englishman with a passion for photographing ancient ruins from the air. He flew over Sicily taking photographs, then moved on to other, more strategic targets. The audacity of the operations was extraordinary. Sidney was literally flying over hostile or potentially hostile territory, photographing military installations, and doing this all under the guise of aerial tourism. The photographs Sidney brought back revealed vital details about military preparations in the region. But the biggest test was yet to come: Nazi Germany itself. In the summer of 1939, tensions in Europe were at breaking point. Adolf Hitler had annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, and everyone knew Poland would be the next target. War was inevitable. It was only a matter of when. In this dangerous context, Sidney undertook his most audacious missions over Nazi Germany. Flying his Lockheed 11A with his hidden cameras, Sidney flew over German military installations, naval bases, and troop concentrations. He used every imaginable cover story. Sometimes he was a businessman, other times an aviation enthusiast exploring Europe, always with a plausible excuse for being where he shouldn't be. Sidney's ability to deceive German authorities was remarkable. He possessed a natural charm and unwavering confidence that helped him extricate himself from difficult situations. More importantly, he understood psychology. People see what they expect to see. And no one expected a civilian pilot in a sleek business jet to be secretly photographing military installations for British intelligence. The photographs Sidney brought back revealed vital details about German naval activity and troop concentrations. British intelligence finally had eyes on Hitler's war preparations, and those eyes belonged to a crazy Australian flying over enemy territory with hidden cameras in his plane. But Sidney's most famous mission would take place in early September 1939. He was in Berlin when the news arrived Germany had invaded Poland. Great Britain and France had issued an ultimatum to Hitler to withdraw his troops. When Hitler ignored the ultimatum, it became clear that war would be declared at any moment. Sidney realized he needed to leave Germany immediately. On the morning of September 3, 1939, hours before Britain officially declared war on Germany, Sidney took off from Berlin in his Lockheed 11A. It was literally the last British civilian aircraft to leave the German capital before the start of World War II. The flight back to England was tense. Sidney wasn't sure if he would be intercepted by German fighter planes or if he would manage to cross the English Channel before war was officially declared. but his luck and skill prevailed once again. When Sidney landed in Britain that morning, he was greeted by British customs officials. With his typical sense of humor, he informed them that he had just left Berlin that morning. The official's reply was classic. "Left a little late, didn't you?" They had no idea what Sidney had actually been doing. Sidney Cotton's adventures over Nazi Germany even inspired a biography titled Sidney Cotton, The Last Plane Out of Berlin, commemorating this extraordinary feat. But far from being the end of his contribution to the war effort, it was only the beginning. Sidney had proven that high-speed, high-altitude photographic reconnaissance was not only possible, but extremely effective. He had demonstrated that with the right aircraft, the right modifications, and the right approach, it was possible to obtain vital intelligence without being detected. And now, with war declared, the Royal Air Force would need these skills more than ever. And Sidney Cotton was about to completely revolutionize the way aerial warfare would be conducted. On September 22, 1939, just 3 weeks after the start of World War II, Sidney received a commission in the Royal Air Force as substantive squadron leader and acting wing commander. It was a notable recognition of his contributions to British intelligence and his unique skills in photographic reconnaissance. During the same period, Sidney was recruited to lead the newly created Photographic Development Unit, or PDU, at Heston Airfield. This unit would provide vital intelligence leading to successful airstrikes on critical enemy installations. But when Sidney took command, the unit was little more than an idea with minimal resources. Sidney's initial operation was extremely small, just 5 officers and 17 other ranks operating from a hangar at the Airworks and Pre-War Aviation Club at Heston. But Sidney had a clear vision of what was needed, and he had the personality to achieve what he wanted, even when told it was impossible. The first challenge was the equipment. The Royal Air Force was using Bristol Blenheim bombers for photographic reconnaissance, generally flying between 1,500 and 3,000 meters. They were frequently intercepted and suffered heavy losses. Sidney knew this approach was unsustainable. What he needed was aircraft that could fly too high and too fast to be intercepted. Sidney wanted Spitfires, the Royal Air Force's most advanced fighter. But all the Spitfires were destined to build up fighter command squadrons, and none could be diverted. Sidney was advised to start with Blenheims and make modifications, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. He used all his contacts and all his persuasive skills. He met with Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the commander of Fighter Command, one of the most powerful officers in the Air Force. Somehow, Sidney managed to convince Dowding to release 2 Spitfires for his unit. It was a remarkable victory against a military bureaucracy reluctant to divert valuable resources.
But obtaining the Spitfires was only the beginning. Sidney had radical ideas about how to modify them for photographic reconnaissance, and not all of them were popular with the RAF traditionalists. Sidney's unit operated under the cover name 2 Camouflage Unit, reflecting the secretive nature of its operations. Sidney immediately began modifying the 2 Spitfires. On October 16, 1939, he received the aircraft and began his work. First, all the armament was removed to reduce weight. The gun ports were sealed. All joints and gaps in the fuselage that could be closed were sealed to improve airspeed. The cockpit was replaced with a sliding canopy featuring teardrop-shaped bubbles on each side, dramatically improving visibility. 2 12-centimeter F-24 cameras were installed in the wings, replacing the internal machine guns, and pointed downwards. But the most important modification was yet to come. Sidney added an extra 110-liter fuel tank behind the pilot. To balance the weight, 14 kilograms of lead weights had been packed into the fuselage behind the tail. These were removed, and the weight of the camera restored the balance. A heating duct was installed leading to the camera compartment, preventing condensation, the same principle Sidney had used in his Lockheed. These modifications transformed the Spitfire into something completely new, a reconnaissance aircraft capable of speeds exceeding 625 kilometers per hour and altitudes where enemy interceptors could not reach it. By October 1939, the unit was fully equipped for operations.
Sidney Cotton was about to prove that his revolutionary approach worked. Sidney Cotton was asked to meet with Air Marshal Arthur Barrett, the commander-in-chief of the RAF contingent in France. Barrett only had Blenheims and Battles for photographic reconnaissance work, and they were suffering devastating losses. The slow aircraft were easy targets for German fighters. Sidney was confident that his modified Spitfire would be unlikely to be detected flying at 9,000 meters altitude. He was right. On November 18, 1939, Maurice Shorty Longbottom flew the first high-altitude reconnaissance mission along the entire German Siegfried Line. It was an extraordinary success. The flight revealed another critical problem. When the film was hastily taken back to Heston for processing, the images were not as clear as needed. The cameras chosen did not provide sufficient detail, and the range was too short. Sidney immediately began working on improvements. He installed upgraded f/24 cameras with 20-centimeter lenses and increased fuel capacity again by adding a 114-liter tank under the left wing. 2 cameras were placed in another bubble under the right wing. This version, first used on February 10, 1940, photographed the German naval bases at Wilhelmshaven and Emden. But Sidney had another crucial innovation in mind: camouflage. He developed a special light blue color that would become known as PRU Blue, in honor of the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit. This color was specifically designed to make the Spitfire blend into the sky at high altitudes, making it virtually invisible to observers on the ground and difficult to detect even for enemy fighters. The aircraft also received a highly polished surface, reducing aerodynamic drag and further increasing speed. Sidney personally oversaw each modification, insisting on standards of perfection that frustrated some RAF technicians with his meticulousness. The results spoke for themselves. Since the beginning of the war, the RAF had photographed 4,000 square kilometers of enemy territory with the loss of 40 aircraft, mostly Blenheims. The French had photographed 9,600 square kilometers with the loss of 60 aircraft. Sidney's small fleet, consisting of only 2 Spitfires, covered 8,000 square kilometers in just 3 flights without suffering a single loss. The effectiveness was too impressive to ignore. The Admiralty asked Sidney to photograph Wilhelmshaven to see if the Tirpitz, the fearsome German battleship, was there. Sidney informed the Air Ministry, aware that all requests had to be made at that level. He was surprised to discover how fierce the inter-service rivalry was. He was informed that under no circumstances could he deal directly with the Navy. So, when he was invited to a meeting with Sir Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord, to discuss the photographs, he assumed his senior RAF officers knew about it. They didn't, and they weren't happy. This was one of the many times Sidney's independent nature created friction with military authority. He was accustomed to doing things his own way, following what he thought was logical and efficient, rather than adhering to military protocols and hierarchies. His unit even had a special badge with the initials CC-11, signifying the 11th commandment: "Thou shalt not be discovered." Sidney cherished his reputation for being unconventional and even wore that badge as a symbol of pride. Under Sidney's leadership, the unit acquired nicknames that reflected its unique nature: Cotton's Club and the less flattering Cotton's Crooks, mainly due to Sidney's propensity for disregarding regulations. But the results were undeniable, and even those who disapproved of his methods could not argue against his success. Sidney's small team of pilots worked tirelessly with frequent long flights. Sidney asked Winterbotham of MI6 to rent an apartment in Paris so they could properly relax when not on operations. This was appreciated by the pilots, who were under enormous pressure. However, this was soon considered by the authorities to be just another transgression by Cotton. He was subsequently accused of organizing wild parties with many women, referred to as his brothel. Less known was the fact that he was also managing many of his businesses and even acted as an agent for his Mexican arms trafficking friends, organizing the supply of weapons to the French. Significantly, on his frequent flights, Sidney preferred to use small French airfields whenever possible, far from the scrutiny of the RAF. This independence and disregard for official procedures would eventually cause serious problems. Meanwhile, Sidney's technical innovations continued. He developed further modifications to the Spitfire engines to produce more power at high altitudes. The aircraft were adapted to fly ever higher and faster.
Sidney also experimented with different paint schemes, including pale pink for sunrise and sunset operations. The Photographic Development Unit was renamed several times, first as the 2nd Camouflage Unit on November 1, 1939, then as the Photographic Development Unit on January 17, 1940, then the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit on June 18, 1940, and finally on November 14, 1940, as the No. 1 Photographic Reconnaissance Unit. In May 1940, when the Germans broke through Belgium, the unit's workload increased dramatically. The 4 Spitfires were frequently flying 5 missions a day. The photographs they brought back were vital to Allied military planning, revealing German troop movements, tank concentrations, and invasion preparations. Sidney also personally flew another important reconnaissance flight with his Lockheed 12A over Soviet Azerbaijan via Iraq in 1940, as part of preparations for Operation Pike. His willingness to undertake missions personally, rather than just commanding from the safety of an office, earned him the respect of his pilots.
During this period, Sidney also worked on other innovations. In September 1940, he pursued the idea of an airborne searchlight for night fighters, which he called aerial target illumination. He enlisted the help of William Helmore, and together they registered patents on the techniques. Helmore, an RAF officer on active duty, then sponsored the development of what became known as turbine light. Sidney's mind never stopped working on problems. He saw challenges where others saw impossibilities, and he had the technical skill and determination to turn ideas into reality. But his independent nature and disregard for authority were about to catch up with him. With the fall of France in May and June 1940, Sidney returned from France, transporting for a fee Marcel Boussac, the head of the Christian Dior clothing and perfume empire. This action would be used against him by his critics within the RAF. On June 17, 1940, Sidney Cotton was removed from his post and banned from any involvement with air operations. The official reason was that he had accepted money to fly a French businessman to the United Kingdom while evacuating British agents from Paris. For RAF superiors, this was the last straw in a long series of transgressions. Sidney had many enemies among the traditional RAF officers. His reluctance to follow procedures, his independence, his flamboyant style, and his success in achieving results without following proper channels had irritated many powerful people. They saw an opportunity to get rid of this troublesome Australian, and they seized it. The irony was bitter. Sidney had literally created the RAF's modern photographic reconnaissance capability from scratch. He had developed the techniques, modified the aircraft, trained the pilots, and proven that the concept worked. His innovations were saving British lives and providing vital intelligence, and now he was being sidelined. The decision was especially painful because it came at a time when Britain most needed every advantage against Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain was beginning, and photographic reconnaissance would be absolutely critical to the nation's defense. Some of his defenders argued that Sidney was indispensable, that his technical genius and experience were irreplaceable, but his detractors were stronger. They argued that military discipline was more important than individual genius, and that Sidney had repeatedly demonstrated that he could not or would not follow the rules. Wing Commander Geoffrey Tuttle was appointed to replace Sidney as commander of the unit. Tuttle was everything Sidney was not: conventional, respectful of authority, and politically astute. Under Tuttle, the unit would expand enormously in size and capability, but the foundations had been laid by Sidney Cotton. Sidney tried to fight his removal. He wrote letters, made appeals, contacted people he knew in positions of power, but the decision was final. His services as an RAF officer were terminated, although he continued to do occasional work for various government agencies for the remainder of the war. In July 1940, after his removal, Sidney proposed a radical idea to the Ministry of Economic Warfare and the Organization of Special Operations Executives to carry out an air raid on the Tirso Dam in Italian Sardinia. The dam supplied electricity to a huge aluminum refinery in Bolzano, which in turn produced 10% of Italy's total aluminum production. Sidney argued that destroying the dam would blind the refinery and deal a significant blow to the Axis war effort. But his plans were never approved. The authorities were not interested in hearing ideas from someone who had been removed from his command. Sidney's frustration was palpable. He had so many ideas, so much experience, so much to offer,
But now he was a voice in the jungle, ignored by the military establishment he had served so well. In the years following the war, Sidney continued his civilian business dealings, but military aviation, his true passion, was now beyond his reach. He watched from afar as the unit he had created grew and developed, using the principles and techniques he had established. The photographic reconnaissance unit would eventually become a key force in Allied intelligence operations, providing critical photographs that enabled the success of D-Day and many other operations. Thousands of lives were saved thanks to the techniques Sidney had pioneered, but he himself was excluded from seeing his legacy in action. It was an unfair end for a man who had given so much, but Sidney Cotton was never one to wallow in self-pity. He had other plans, other businesses, other adventures waiting. After World War II, Sidney Cotton returned fully to civilian life. His previous investments in business acumen had provided him with considerable financial resources, and he threw himself into various ventures with the same energy he had applied to military aviation. Sidney was elected a Fellow of the Royal Photographic Society in 1941 in recognition of his contributions to aerial photography. It was a well-deserved honor, though small in comparison to his actual contribution to the Allied war effort. But Sidney's personal life was changing again. In 1942, he divorced his second wife, Millicent. 2 years later, in 1944, he married for a third time to Patricia Mary Lindsay Els Farnborough. This would be his longest marriage. In the post-war years, Sidney remained involved in business and occasionally consulted on aviation matters. He never lost his passion for flying and technical innovation. His mind remained active, always looking for the next problem to solve, the next challenge to overcome. During the 1950s and 1960s, Sidney lived relatively quietly. His extraordinary contribution to the Allied victory in World War II was not widely known to the public. The photographic reconnaissance work he had pioneered remained largely classified, and even within the RAF, Sidney Cotton's story was being forgotten or minimized. Some of his military historians and aviation experts recognized his importance, but to the general public, Sidney Cotton was an unknown name. This lack of recognition must have been particularly painful for a man who had repeatedly risked his life and whose innovations had saved countless lives.
In 1969, at the age of 75, Sidney finally published his memoirs under the title Aviator Extraordinary, The Sidney Cotton Story. The book detailed his adventures in the First and Second World Wars, his espionage flights over Nazi Germany, the creation of the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, and his eventual removal from command. The book was well received by those who read it, but it didn't become a bestseller. Sidney's story was fascinating, but 24 years after the end of the war, the public was more interested in the future than in revisiting the past. Sidney spent his final years in the United Kingdom, surrounded by his family. Patricia, his third wife, remained by his side until the end. He now had a total of 7 children from his 3 marriages, and found some peace in family life that had been so frequently interrupted by his adventures. But even in old age, Sidney retained his characteristic personality, stubborn, independent, confident in his own ideas, and impatient with unnecessary authority. Those who knew him in these final years described a man still sharp-witted, still passionate about aviation, and still convinced that his ideas had been correct all along. Sidney Cotton passed away on February 14, 1969, just a few months before his 75th birthday. He died at his home in the United Kingdom, surrounded by those he loved. His death received some attention in the British press, with obituaries acknowledging his contributions to military aviation, but for many, it remained an unknown story. He was buried quietly, without grand military ceremonies, without significant official recognition from the government he had served so well. It was a peaceful end to an extraordinary life. Today, more than 50 years after his death, military historians and aviation experts recognize Sidney Cotton as one of the most important figures in the development of modern air intelligence. His contributions were fundamental not only to the Allied victory in World War II, but to shaping the entire nature of modern warfare. Before Sidney Cotton, aerial reconnaissance was a dangerous, inefficient, and often ineffective operation. Slow aircraft flew at low altitudes, making them easy targets for anti-aircraft defenses and enemy fighters. Loss rates were unsustainable, and the quality of the photographs obtained often left much to be desired. Sidney revolutionized this field completely. He proved that fast aircraft flying at high altitude could obtain detailed photographs without being intercepted. He developed the necessary technical modifications to make this work: heated cameras, extra fuel tanks, polished surfaces, and the iconic PRU Blue camouflage. Most importantly, Sidney established the operational principles that would guide photographic reconnaissance for decades. The photographic reconnaissance unit he created served as a model for similar units in all modern air forces. The techniques he developed are still taught in military schools around the world. During World War II, the photographic reconnaissance unit took millions of photographs of Axis-controlled territory. These photographs were essential to virtually every major Allied operation. The planning of D-Day would have been impossible without the detailed photographs of German coastal defenses provided by the PRU. Allied strategic bombing raids on Germany relied on PRU photographs to identify targets and assess damage. Commando operations in occupied France used PRU photographs for planning. Even the Allied submarine campaign against Axis merchant ships depended on photographic intelligence about ports and naval movements. Conservative estimates suggest that Sidney Cotton's innovations saved tens of thousands of Allied lives by enabling more precise and efficient missions. Other estimates suggest that the number could reach hundreds of thousands when considering the full impact on shortening the war. After World War II, Sidney's principles were applied to the development of even more advanced reconnaissance aircraft. The Lockheed U-2, which flew espionage missions over the Soviet Union during the Cold War, was a direct descendant of Sidney's modified Spitfires. Modern reconnaissance satellites are the ultimate evolution of Sidney's vision of obtaining high-altitude intelligence undetected. In 2020, more than half a century after his death, the Royal Air Force finally gave Sidney Cotton the recognition he deserved in life. A documentary was produced about his contributions, and his story began to be more widely known. But perhaps Sidney's greatest legacy is not the honors or recognition, but the fact that his fundamental approach to aerial intelligence remains valid to this day. In a world of drones, satellites, and stealth aircraft, the principles Sidney established remain the same: fly high, fly fast, don't be seen, and bring intelligence back. Sidney Cotton was a man ahead of his time, an innovator who saw possibilities where others saw only problems. He was stubborn, difficult, unconventional, and brilliant. He saved lives, shortened the war, and changed history. This was the mad mechanic who built a ghost plane that the Nazis couldn't see. And thanks to him, the world would never be the same again.